And I think I'm finished. So, has everybody else finished now then? Are we all ready to rumble, as they say? Yes. There we go. So Gareth watched it at 1.5 speed. I like that. That's cool. I do that. I hope I've not put anybody to sleep doing it like that. Yeah, I must apologise though. It's having to use YouTube in that way was a technological limitation. So I could have broadcast the video via the webinar, but because of the nature of the webinar, it would have been really jerky and not very clear. That my hands and the paper would have been out of sequence with my voice. So I apologise for that. I mean, I would like some feedback on that actually. So I'm going to put another poll up and see how that goes. So what did you think? Honestly, what did you think to the video? Don't pull any punches. It was all right. Okay, thanks. Come on, somebody must have thought it was a bit boring or rubbish. Cool. So I'm going to take it that everybody has finished now. If you haven't finished, then please let me know in the questions box. Otherwise, I'm going to move on and take on it. Okay, right then. So I'm going to turn the poll off and I'm going to put my face back on. So I hope I don't offend you. Right, I need to share my screen. So let's do that. Show my screen. Right, there we go. Excellent. Right, so are we all awake? Are we all ready to move? Are we ready to go? That's 38 minutes of viewing pleasure, I think they say. Right. I don't know if that's working. Yes, I think it's working. Brilliant. Right, let's move forward. So, first off, identifying the accident's unwanted outcomes. So I've just made a quick list of things off of the top of my head. I know that some of you railway experts will give me the specific details, but this is just an illustrative example. So there were a number of things that happened, a number of outcomes. So we had the derailment, we had some consequences of the derailment, we had the potential for the vehicles fouling the running lines or encountering other hazards. We had the OLE, the overhead line equipment structure, fouling the running lines, the possibility a train collision into the OLE structure, damage, destruction of property. Fortunately, there was no human injury or death, but there was a potential for that. There was a definite potential or actual loss of revenue. And then, not in this particular circumstance, but in other circumstances, there may have been the spectre of prosecution. So what are the hazards associated with that? So again, I'm not an expert in this field, so these are off the top of my head. So a train signal passed at danger through the trap points, the fouled running lines, and then a potential for a train loss of safe separation with another train. So they're the hazards, you know, just high-level hazards, hazardous behaviour. And then the associated, sorry, right, I'll come back to that question. So the high-level safety constraints are essentially a transformation of those hazards. So one of the high-level safety constraints is thou shalt protect the running lines from fouling, whether that's by vehicles or other objects or structures. Another high-level safety constraint is maintaining the safe separation between trains and fixed structures, and also preventing the train departure when lines are in an unsafe state. And then also the signaller and the driver need to have a common understanding of clearances for the train movements. So that's coordination between controllers in different levels of the hierarchy. Okay, so developing the HCS, the exciting part. So this is, as I mentioned earlier on, the case study is only going to focus on this and the comments and value we get out of this because we only have so much time. So this is just a table. When I go through an accident report or do some cast analysis or STPA, I use a table just to capture typically the nouns, names, or entities, components of the system. Now it's not a scientific method. There is a bit of an art to the science, and it does take practice to be able to do this. And this relates as well to the mental gymnastics I was talking about last week, in that when you're first starting to develop control structures, it's not always obvious what to include, what to exclude, and it's not always clear what level of abstraction you want to work to. So generally, and you'll have seen it in the video, generally I pretty much underline everything that sounds like it might be relevant to the control structure or to the components in terms of control algorithms, behaviors, or mental models, or control actions, either actuators or sensory feedback. Now, obviously, when you go through a complicated investigation, you could generate lots and lots of these things that need to go together, and you end up with a massive bird's nest of a control structure. But this is where you abstract and combine things and abstract appropriately, and that comes with a bit of practice. It's not something that you'll pick up straight away. But it does take a little bit of practice, and that is the art of the modelling. So I've got a list of items there. So starting at the top, the UK government, the Rail Accident Investigation Branch, the RAIB, I've spelt that wrong, I'm sorry, the RAIB investigation itself, the Safety Digest report that came out of the investigation, 2 train drivers, some reference materials, information, resources and reminders, trap points themselves, the live running lines. So most of these are physical things, but they could also be organizational or abstract things. They're not necessarily physical. The risk assessments, the trap points. Now I've highlighted that because I haven't highlighted it in the control structure because I wanted to keep it relatively straightforward, but I will talk about that later on. And then of course there's the position light signals, the main signals, the buffer stops. Now they, depending on the context, they could be seen as actuators, or they could be seen as sensors, or they could be seen as control actions from, in the case of the signaller. Then there's the signaller local instructions and special instructions. There is the trains themselves, the physical things that have been moved around. There is Great Western Railway. They are an entity, organisational entity. There's Paddington Station. Now there's 2 parts to Paddington Station. There is the physical station and the railway platforms and signals and tracks and all that stuff. But there is also the Paddington Station Management Organisation, for want of a better description. You've also got the OLE mast and the OLE cantilever structure. You've got the Great Western Railway planned workings, the passenger flow data. So that's not physical, but it's an entity that provides interactions and is used for decision making, which changes control algorithms, updates mental models, changes behaviors, changes the dynamics of the system. Then you've got the daily station working instructions, same sort of thing. You've got the Paddington workstation. So, and I don't know the details of this because I've not researched any further, but I would understand that that is some form of mechanical, electrical, software, possibly computer-based system that interfaces between the signaller himself or herself and the operational railway. And then you've got Network Rail, which is an organisational entity. You've got Network Rail Thames Valley Signalling Centre. So again, that could be a physical centre with the equipment in it where the signaller is sat. So that's physical environmental context, which is isolated from many miles from the actual physical process that was going on that day. And then you've got I've mentioned the position light signals. You've also got radio communications, and there's no detail about that, so I don't know if that's proper radio communications or whether that's via the mobile phone network, or whether it's landlines or anything like that. And then there's the train operating instructions. So they weren't really spoken about in that much detail. There was no detail in the report about who provides those, who makes sure that they're up to date and appropriate for that stretch of track. And then, of course, the critical feedback part of this control structure, the platform signal that prevented the train from departing. And then, of course, we think about personal health and well-being, and I'll talk about that in a bit more detail because that's a bit of an abstract concept. Then the Railway Safety and Standards Board, they're an organisational entity, and they provide some guidance called Document S220, Effects of Fasting on Fitness to Drive. And then there is the track point requirements, which is an old railway group standard. There is the Office of Road and Rail Regulation. Now they're not mentioned explicitly in the Safety Digest report, and obviously you wouldn't expect it because it is a minor report, but they will have some form of interaction or contribution in this particular control structure. And then there is 3 bits of information, 3 other reports: the Bury Safety Digest, the Carbridge Investigation Report, and then the Lord Cullen Ladbroke Grove Report. Now I've not looked at those in any detail, so I don't know what they contain and how they contrast with this particular situation, but obviously that's something we could look at in the future if that's of interest. So this is this is a photo of my whiteboard in my office. I'm really proud of it. It's awesome. If you don't have one, you need to get one. They're brilliant. So this was the first iteration. So as you saw, I went through the list, extracted the relevant entities, organizations, nouns, bodies, and then I've represented them on the whiteboard. And then as you develop the control structure and start to think about the entities and the relationships between them, you'll probably find that you need to iterate it a number of times. And that's why a whiteboard is really good, especially a big whiteboard like a 3x2 whiteboard wall. Brilliant. So this is another iteration of it. So you can see that I've added some control loops. I've added some control loops with dotted lines, which signify that there isn't enough information in the Safety Digest report to make a comment. You know, they're expected interactions. And so if you were doing an accident investigation and you were collecting evidence, you may know about some of the entities and relationships based on the information you have provided as part of the investigation process. But by doing the development of the control structure, you might identify that a particular interaction, a particular control action, or a particular feedback path, transmission of information is particularly important to the facts of the investigation. And so by drawing those interactions, you can then see whether you need to go and collect further evidence, or perhaps even start investigating down a different path. And you'll notice that I've included, in the center, I've included a little red arrow and a question mark that says, so you've got the platform signal SN1, which signaled to the driver of the second train in the station to stop. And so my question, and the reason I've included that red arrow, is because there's no information about how that came to occur, whether it was an automatic mechanism or whether it was provided by the signaller or how that works. And I know Steve Carpenter, he's highlighted that is a standard protection control system that's that as part of the track circuit. I mean, I don't know any details about that, but just as a layperson from a railway perspective applying this method, just by drawing the control structure, it's forced me to think, well, how did that platform signal occur? How did it act? How did it influence the driver? And what caused it to act? What was the control action acting on the platform signal? And what happens if that platform signal didn't occur? Or significantly, if driver 2 missed that signal? So that sort of helps to highlight areas that may need to be further investigated, or even as part of the recommendations of the incident, one of the recommendations might be, well, given that we were heavily dependent on this platform signal going to red and the driver noticing that and stopping the train, were there any other factors at play? Was this driver, perhaps this driver was also in a similar, also recognizing Ramadan. Perhaps that was a contributory factor that we need to think about. Now, I'm not pointing fingers or anything like that. All I'm saying is this method of drawing the control structure and thinking about the entities, thinking about the interactions, whether they're control actions or sensory feedback, or whether it's just information to update their mental model or influence their behavior. Those kind of questions are very powerful and can help steer the direction of the investigation and also the recommendations. Okay, so this is a process of iteration and redrawing, reforming. So obviously the first drawing was a bit scruffy and needed to be sorted out. And so as I went through and developed a more clearly drawn process, control structure, obviously as you go through, there's a lot of information there and you don't want to miss anything because obviously it's a safety investigation. So I tend to start to draw the control structure on the right-hand side and iterate it. And as I include an entity or the relationship, I will mark it off so that I can see that I haven't missed anything. And obviously this is part way through the process. This is not a complete control structure. Okay, so this is an almost complete control structure drawn on my whiteboard. So you can see in the center, or nearly the center, you've got the driver of the train 3 Hotel 52. So that's the train that derailed. And then on the right-hand side, you've got the driver of the train that was still in the station at the platform. And then towards the top, you've got the signaller. And so the signaller is in control of the position light signals. And I'm presuming, because I don't know, but I'm presuming that the Paddington workstation is the interface between the signaller and the lights, the position light signals out on the track, the length of track. Now it is said in the digest that there is some communications between the signaller through some kind of radio communications. Now this is an interesting interaction because, like air traffic control, the whole point of that interaction between radio comms, the whole point of the control actions through radio communications or through the position light signals is that the signaller imparts in the driver an update to his mental model. And that mental model is supposed to be, I'm giving you a signal, position light signal, Sierra November 6006, and that is to permit you to go to the next position light signal and not to go straight on into the station. Now, the driver's mental model was based on the timetable and the driving instruction, the order instructions. I can't remember the official terminology, but the driver had a mental model which did not match the safe state that the signaller was trying to impart. And so in the communications between the signaller and the driver, it would be interesting to know, as part of the investigation, some questions to ask, to go and understand what happened on those radio communications. Are those communications recorded for the purposes of accident investigation? And if they are, they should be reviewed to understand what the challenges were with regards to the signaller making sure that the driver's mental model was correctly updated so that the driver could behave safely. So for me, that is a really key part of the investigation, and just seeing it drawn simply on a model such as this, it's easy to talk around, it's easy to generate important, specific, directed questions so that you can then go off as part of your investigation and look for that extra evidence. Because it may be that communication was perfectly fine, everybody understood what was going on at each end of that interaction, and so you can then turn away from that part of the investigation and look at other things. That I mentioned about the health and well-being of this particular driver and his fitness to drive. So if you eliminate the fact that the radio communication system was working fine and that the signaller and the driver spoke correctly, they both used standard radio communications terminology or something like that. I mean, in air traffic control, radio communications are recorded for accident investigation. It's a legal requirement. The way that the signaller and the driver interact, their language, English is the national ICAO standard language, the radio phraseology, There are attempts to standardise that phraseology, but I'm sure you can appreciate from a global air transport perspective that's very challenging. But in this context, was that a contribution? Was the signal not using standard language? The next question is, well, is standard language necessitated for safety? And if it's not, well, why isn't it? Is it because the regulator hasn't said that that's the case? Is it because they've tried it and it failed, or why is that? So there's some really valuable questions straight away from that perspective. Okay, so I redrew it in Visio, so it's a bit easier to see. And I'm going to go through and talk about the development of the control structure. So obviously I started with that big list of the various entities and nouns and such like. So let's start with the physical process. So what is the physical process that our hierarchical control structure, our system is designed to control? What are the hazards we're trying to avoid? So the first off is we need to keep train safe separation. So the physical process at the bottom is the live lines, and it's about train separation. So I've included obviously the train has a driver, you know, it's not difficult to do that bit of the control structure. But in terms of the interaction between the train and the live lines, on this occasion, the interaction didn't occur because the track points took care of that. They interacted with the train, they prevented the train from causing problems with live lines. Now, unfortunately, the train derailed and interacted with the OLE mast, which interacted with the OLE cantilever structure, which interacted, unfortunately, with some live lines. So there was still a safety-related incident. You know, I don't know how significant that is in terms of the railway operation and whether it's recoverable, you know, if a train hits it or something like that. But this small part of the control structure just shows how significant the track points were in preventing the train from getting interacting with the live lines. So moving up the control structure, who interacts with the train driver to control the live lines and the train safe separation? So we've got two aspects here. We've got the signaller interacting through the Paddington workstation and in control of the position light signals, but there is also a control and feedback path through the radio communications with the train driver. So that's building the control structure up even more. And then we consider that there is another train driver driving a train that potentially interacts with those live lines, but they at this stage are not really part of the consideration of the control structure until we then think about, well, how do we stop that other train from colliding with our train or the OLE mast and equipment that's collapsed over the live lines? And so that mitigation, that controller or control action, is in the form of the platform signal SN1. Now I'm assuming and presuming that the signaller will also have radio communications with the train driver. But this particular inclusion of that feedback loop poses the question, on the day of the accident, was the signaller in contact with the second train driver? Are they required to do that? And if they are, what are the safety implications of that? You know, in terms of if the platform signal for whatever reason doesn't work, or the train driver misses that signal, like train driver 3H52 did, then the question is, does the signaller automatically get in touch with those trains to stop them running? And that poses a question, well, does this particular signaller need to know the status of that part of the track, the station, and the trains that are getting ready to depart, and be ready to issue the stop, stop, stop signal if that's the case? Now, obviously, I'm not a railway expert. I'm coming at this from an aerospace and defence background, so I'm able to ask those hypothetical questions and then get the SMEs involved and progress the analysis. But these are just from the control structure. It allows somebody who is effectively a layperson to ask some very pointed and powerful questions, and also for the investigators to go and look for evidence. Okay, so moving on. So let's look at the train driver now. So what's the control structure above the train driver? So we've got the Great Western Railway. they must have some kind of control over the driver training and qualification. There's no detail in the Safety Digest report. I'm asserting that that's the case, and so as part of the investigation, naturally they would look at driver training and qualification. And so this points you to think about, well, what's the driver, what is their interaction with their own training and qualification? Are they expected to keep up to standard, or are they more actively dealt with by their employer, Great Western Railways? Do they take an active approach to driver training? And then you think about the reminders and information resources, which the Safety Digest was very clear about it, very emphasised. So where does that information come from? Who's in control of that information? And how does that fit in with Great Western Railway? Is it provided by Great Western Railway, or does it come from somewhere else? Is it up to date? What are the implications if it's not up to date? You know, so it allows you to ask questions about, well, perhaps the driver was operating in accordance with those information resources, you know, the track layout or the signals en route, the route diagrams, but the accident occurred, you know. And then also thinking about the train operating instructions, so the maximum speed. Clearly the driver was aware of that information, but where does that information come from with respect to the track points? Is there some specific requirements for track points on that particular stretch of track or across any track points that the driver needed to know about so that they could stop in time to prevent that particular interaction with the OLE structure? Now, it is mentioned that the train was at the maximum allowable speed, but they also mentioned excuse me, that Paddington was particularly busy and constrained or cramped. So the question then is, well, was it really appropriate that that operating speed was in effect on that part of the track, given the specifics of that particular station layout? So let's move on above the signaller. So the signaller, there is a mention of some entities called managers, and they presumably provide special instructions to the signaller with regards to position light signal to position light signal manoeuvring. And they're part of the TVSC, which could be a set of managers or a physical entity, and they're under the control of Network Rail. So the signaller, using the special instructions, interacted with the train driver. So the question from an investigation point of view, and it's mentioned in the Safety Digest, were those special instructions really appropriate for the conditions at the time in that specific situation? And the answer is actually no, it's not. But there was no sort of emphasis on, well, if it's not acceptable for that station because it's too busy, then how are you going to enforce the safety constraints? What changes do you need to make to either the control structure or the control actions in that control structure? So one of the recommendations might be that there's a review of those special instructions in the context of the Paddington station, but a more broader recommendation might be, well, what about other stations? Does this same potential weakness in the control structure exist in other places? And so the regulator may be required to go and kick that investigation off. And then looking at the daily station working instructions, so they have an interaction on the signaller and the way that the way the network is managed. But where does that information come from? Who makes those decisions? And do they appreciate that those decisions, last-minute changes, have an impact that flows down the control structure and potentially sets the train driver up to fail? So they're the kind of questions, and also the passenger deck flow data. Now this is an interesting one. You might find this intriguing. So the passenger flow data, wherever it comes from, whoever generates that information, however it's stored, however it's processed, however it's communicated, what are the impacts if that information is incorrect or not, is slow or delayed, or provided, you know, it doesn't provide the correct real picture of the real world? What effect does that have on the rest of the control structure? Now, from a safety perspective, you would like to expect that that information shouldn't have any impact upon safety at all, but the fact that it interacts with these controllers, updates their mental models, potentially changes their control algorithms, their behaviors, then obviously that has some impact on safety, and understanding to what extent that impact is important to understanding the causal scenarios in the accident. So moving on to the next one. So picking up on track points then. So the track points, there are a set of network rail requirements for the track points. So I've drawn the track points there, and I've drawn an interaction to the actual track points. And then I've also followed on with a further interaction, hypothetical interaction, because I don't know the specific details, but there is an implied interaction between those requirements and the actual train operating instructions. So one of the investigation parts might be to go and look for that interaction, look for evidence of it. Were the train operating instructions with the maximum speed correct in accordance with the requirements for that specific set of track points for that driver in that location? And also perhaps, well, what about the track point requirements? Are they really appropriate for this particular implementation at Paddington Station? And what if the Paddington Station is not in accordance with those requirements, or they have some form of special dispensation that could be called into question? And also, what about those track point requirements implemented elsewhere across the railway? Perhaps there's an investigation angle in that dimension. And then moving on to the Railway Standards and Safety Board. So they talk about a document they produced called the Effects on Fasting on Fitness to Drive. So I've included that with a dotted line and an arrow to GWR, because I'm presuming that they would be the customer of that information and the recipient of it. And then it raises questions, well, how did GWR as the operating company, how did they implement that guidance, or what impacts upon their control structure did that guidance have? Now, I've not been able to model any details because I have no idea. All I've done is said, well, this particular driver's health and well-being, what are the interactions with that? Does GWR as the operator, do they have an interaction upon that? And if they do, what's the extent of it? And if they don't, well, why is that? What are the interactions there? You know, what are the real interactions that existed, but what are the potential solutions? How could we engineer this control structure to eliminate this risk, or perhaps manage it more appropriately, more robustly? And it might literally be that for a particular subset of drivers, for a particular time window, they're not allocated to particular driving tasks, for example. I mean, I don't know the detail, I'm not being political, I'm just looking at it from a safety management aspect. But they're the kind of questions that it prompts you to think about. Okay, so moving on. Finally then, oh, one of my boxes has moved. So finally, we've got consideration of the Office of Road and Rail Regulation. I thought it was just Office of Rail Regulation, but now it includes road. So that's interesting because the control structure at that high level, that particular entity now has more than just railways as responsibility. And there are a number of other entities that I've not included there because I've just not had the time. But then there's also the UK government. What interactions do they have on this? What safety related responsibilities do they have? What safety constraints have not been enforced that's led to this accident? And then over on the left hand side there is the RAIB Safety Digest report. So I've highlighted, and this is significant, so I've highlighted an arrow that literally says, where does this go? Where does this information go? Who is it for? Who does it interact with? And what implications does it have for the control structure? So the recommendations, you know, I mean, I've spoken quite a few about recommendations that I have as not being an expert in railways, and I'm sure the railway guys can say, well, most of that, Simon's, a load of nonsense, but there's a few interesting nuggets there that we need to think about. So the interaction here I've highlighted is purely to force the question, what is the Safety Digest intended to do, What are the recommendations intended to do? And more significantly, how does the RAIB close the feedback loop to make sure that those changes in the control structure have been achieved and are successful? And so you would expect, potentially those interactions affect various different parts of this structure, but the feedback between, for example, the GWR in terms of operating the trains and the trains and the drivers, and then from Network Rail TVSC and how the signaller operates, operates the railway. So that's an interesting interaction. Okay, so you'll probably recall from last week that I highlighted sort of a nice red in the center and dark on the outside, and that was just to highlight that the red area is the physical process that, where the direct impacts upon safety have occurred. And then as you move upwards and outwards from the control structure, then you can start to see more indirect causal factors and causal scenarios. And obviously the dark blue is more remote from the accident scene, the accident sequence. And as you move up the control structure, the timing, dimensions of time change. So things can happen very slowly above over many years, but when you're down on the front line, the red area, there's very immediate potential issues. Now, just to highlight the safety digest extent, so I've just chucked a nice jagged line in there just to show the extent of the safety digest comments. So they haven't really gone into any great detail out over and above those areas. And one particular area for me to look at of interest is the platform signal SN1 and the train driver. So obviously that train didn't depart the station, and that's what we wanted, so the safety constraints were enforced. But if those safety constraints were not enforced, then potentially that train would have left the station and potentially either impacted this train or impacted the collapsed line side equipment, the overhead equipment. And so I'd be interested, from an investigation perspective, to go and look at that and confirm why the platform signal and the train driver were successful on this occasion. And I suppose for those who are familiar with the safety 2 concept, where you look at why it was successful, why we were still safe, then that is part of safety management and proactive safety. Okay, so some questions, comments, observations and recommendations. We're nearly finished now, so don't fall asleep just yet. We're nearly finished. So some of the top interesting topics that have come out of this. So thinking about the train driver's health and well-being. So obviously the train driver has a responsibility for their own health and well-being, as everybody does. But the question is, well, does the train operating company also have some implications or interactions with that? I know we have drink and drugs regulations and that kind of stuff, but that questions how the train operator enforces those regulations, what the control structure is around making sure that the driver turns up to work and is fit and healthy to be able to conduct safety-related operations. And then also the other key human controllers. So in this case, the signaller and the other train driver. It will be interesting to know what the interactions are between themselves and their own health and well-being, and whether their railway operating control structure also manages that stuff or doesn't. And then there's topics around the signallers, IT and software. Now this is more for future consideration. So as we move to more integrated technical and software systems, is there a potential that we're building in systemic faults? And as we move from a more analog system where people talk to each other to digital train controls, is that not something that should be looked at further? Perhaps that's already been dealt with on another railway, and perhaps a safety audit or safety assessment is necessary just to test this particular scenario on those technologies. And then also communications and technology. So he spoke about the radio. I spoke at length about the investigators perhaps looking at the means of communications, the technology, but also the way that the communications were conducted and whether standard phraseology and communication and coordination is necessary. There's also a consideration of the safety assessment of the signallers and their procedures. particularly the special instructions at Paddington, and that they're not, it's a busy station, so we can't really apply them. That's not really an answer. It should be about maintaining and enforcing those safety constraints. And if you're not able to do that, then you need to alter the operating envelope appropriately, or accept that there's going to be more accidents. And also consider, well, do they need to look at other busy stations or other areas of significant threat? And then also consider the platform signal changes due to the derailment. So has there been a check on the maintenance of those signals, and is there appropriate maintenance in place to make sure that those signals work and that the drivers can adhere to them? So there was a mention of the risk assessment, the trap points. So there needs to be consideration or a recognition of the significance of the trap points preventing a more severe accident in this situation. So why did the safety constraints, why were they enforced? Why were we successful on this occasion? And were there any areas where perhaps on a different day we might not have been successful? And I know there's a bit of a tone, and particularly with the media coverage and people on Twitter and Facebook moaning about the train getting derailed and why the hell would you derail a train when it passes a red light? There's a clear balance between operational efficiency and safety, and recognizing how much safety benefit those trap points had on this particular occasion. Because I'm sure it's better to have a train derailed, controlled derail, if you can call it that, than it is having two trains colliding head-on in Paddington Station. And that also, and I haven't included that on the control structure, but it's a very important point. In an accident scenario, an accident condition, there is a feedback loop between the train operating company and the media and or media channels back to the public. So keeping the public informed of what's going on so that they can understand the situation, but also that they can behave appropriately or change behaviours as necessary. I'll talk about that next time. There's a big subject there about coordination with the media. One of the examples I've looked at is to do with a pharmaceuticals accident at a hospital in London a number of years ago, and the way that the hospital handled their interactions with the media was, a good learning source. I'll have to talk about that another time. So the RAIB Safety Digest. So what is the intent of it? What's the audience for it? And what's the action upon those recommendations? And there's a primary focus on the driver and the signaller, as opposed to perhaps recognizing that there are more wider systemic issues than just stupid drivers and stupid signallers. My words. Okay, so just to talk about the limitations of the case study. So obviously this was a quick and dirty review of a single source of information. It's not a full-on investigation report, and what I did was a quick cut-down brief overview. And recognising the government regulator wasn't mentioned, we've spoken about that. And just to highlight the name of that regulator, so it's the Office of Rail and Road Regulation, and they are the independent safety and economic regulator. So from a control structure perspective, you've got an entity that's in control of two potentially conflicting goals. And so it's interesting that that regulator is aligned in that way, and so that might prompt further investigation. But obviously the further you get up the control structure, the more political it gets. Okay, now as an SME, I mentioned this, I don't know what I don't know. I'm not an SME, but as part of the CAST analysis, straight away you can start developing a control structure based on limited information, which will give you value. Obviously, you need to have SMEs involved in developing the control structure and identifying real interactions as opposed to postulated interactions. But as I said, this is just a quick and dirty, and I'm not an SME in railways. And the other important points may have been overlooked because I'm not an SME. Now, I mentioned before about the information horizon. So purposefully on this particular example, I purposefully only looked at the Safety Digest. I did look at one news report, and I obviously saw the Twitter messages because I think I was travelling in and out of June at that time. But I tried to prevent myself from becoming having a biased opinion, if you like. Okay, so that's the end of the case study. Just a couple of notes on learning from others. So I'm going to have a quick drink and I'll talk about that. So if you want some good examples of cast, I recommend having a look at Nancy's book, Chapter 5, Appendix B and Appendix C. So Chapter 5 is about an American friendly fire incident over Iraq in the 90s, Gulf War I. Appendix B is a NASA satellite loss, and Appendix C is a water supply contamination example. And she walks through those, she draws the control structures, she highlights the process and talks about it. Have a look at that. It is a lot of information there. And then also the MIT Partnership for Systems Approach to Safety. So as I mentioned last time, there is a lot of presentations on the website, a lot of slide packs that you can look at, a lot of other examples of CAST and its application, and particularly the control structures. Because as I say, it is a model-based technique, and the control structure is the core part. And getting good at being able to develop those and abstract those means that you'll be more effective in applying this technique. And then, of course, Nancy's own website. Now, it's important to point out that you can use this method to learn a lot about your own industry, about the accidents you're having, but you can also learn a lot from other accidents in other industries, because obviously the stamp-based analysis technique where you build the control structure, it is technology application independent. It doesn't really care what you're going to apply it to. The principles of building the control structure, the control loops, interactions between components, all of that good stuff, control theory and systems theory applies to anything. And so if you apply this method to accidents that are perhaps similar to what you're doing or of interest, you might be able to draw parallels and use that learning to benefit the work that you do in your industry. So it gives you information about the specific accident and other similar accidents, and it also gives you information about the investigation method and, of course, the way it was conducted, and about the recommendations and their potential effectiveness. Now, it's interesting and important to point out that most existing reports are typically written from the perspective of the event-based direct causality model, and so obviously CAST will view the content of that report and in a different way, and will generate perhaps more causes, more specific causes, and more recommendations, perhaps different or even conflicting recommendations. So it's important to recognize whenever you look at an existing report, you will find extra things that are not mentioned in the report. And that's not necessarily to say the investigation was not very good. It may be that the report wasn't very well written, or perhaps the report and investigation didn't go far enough. And CAST, and this is important, and I think Charles has left now, but I think he mentioned this. CAST often identifies crucial information and evidence that was not obtained as part of the original investigation process, or it can highlight where crucial information was not included in the accident report. So the accident report might conclude something, but it's because they didn't collect other crucial information that might change the conclusions and recommendations. So there is some limitations of the existing reports, as I've mentioned. So usually they clearly describe the events, i.e. what happened, but analysis of why those events is usually incomplete. And I'm not picking spots on anybody, that's just generally how it is. And the analysis typically stops after finding someone to blame. So you'll recall from the previous slide where I had the zigzag line from the Safety Digest, that was just a representation of where the analysis typically stops. And also the recommendations are generally of the must try harder next time or do a review, i.e. no real targeted valuable recommendations. And not all investigation reports are the same. Some are brilliant, some are not so good. I'm just saying generally the recommendations could be more specific, and CAST gives you that more specific, more powerful. Okay, so that's the end of that bit. Just to remind you, we've got the mini-series part 3 next week, the aerospace example. Now I'm really looking forward to this one, even more so than the railway one, because this is very real. This is a more detailed investigation report. I will have to have a think about putting you guys through a long video. I don't know if I want to do that. I'd really appreciate your feedback on that, actually, whether you think that's a way forward or whether I need to rethink that. But we'll sort something out. Okay, so let me just ask you a question then. Based on what you've heard today, what do you think your organisation would look like if you were to use CAST as part of your investigations? And what do you think your organisation would look like if you could identify more causes of accidents and near misses more quickly? And what about if you could make recommendations that were more specific and effective at preventing future accidents? Would you like me to help? Well, if you would, please follow this link, provide your details, and I'll schedule a call meeting and we can discuss that. I will put the website address up again in a little while,